Hello to anyone watching this. During the hype cycle of each generation, the first and most exciting Pokemon revealed are of course the starters, but recently I've not been feeling quite as buzzed about them. The main reason for this is the predictability of their final evolutions. These days a lot of them end up being quite anthropomorphic and have one of only a few dual typings. There isn't really much mystery to it. So today I just wanted to go through the history of dual type starter Pokemon to point out the patterns that have led us to where I feel we are now, and give a few examples of fresher dual type starter Pokemon that I think would be more fun to see in future generations. Now obviously before I say anything else, I do need to give the massive disclaimer that I do still enjoy the starter Pokemon that I end up choosing. Whenever I play a Pokemon game, the type and move makeup of my entire team is built around my starter Pokemon. They are with me from start to finish, so there's no way I can't appreciate them. And obviously I don't know what it takes to develop a Pokemon, both visually and moveset wise. I just feel like starter Pokemon have gotten a bit repetitive, and I'd like to suggest how I would personally fix that, So yeah, just don't take this as an attack on previous starter Pokemon. This isn't about fixing or improving them. I can't imagine a timeline with any other starter Pokemon at this point. This is just about the future of the series. So with all of that in mind, let us respectfully criticise the sins of the past. So out of the 30 final evolutions for starter Pokemon, 20 of them are dual types, while the other 10 are left as single types. Which, as a quick aside, while I am only going to be talking about future starter Pokemon being dual types, I do still love all of the single type starter Pokemon. They all perfectly represent the type they have, I can't imagine giving any of them a second type. It's just from this point on they're not really going to be a part of the discussion, So yeah, out of the 20 dual type starter Pokemon, 13 of them have either fighting, ghost or dark as their second type. Do you understand how I'd feel that they're getting a bit repetitive at this point, But it's at the same time, I completely understand why they keep choosing these three types over and over again. Because obviously the main point of their primary types is that they form an effectiveness triangle, where each of the three types are effective against one and weak against another. And Ghost, Dark and Fighting also form an effectiveness triangle. And I do really enjoy having this extra triangle, it feels like it adds a extra layer of depth to these starter Pokemon and how they interact with each other. I just wish it was a slightly more varied layer. Delphox and Primarina are good examples of how this can be more varied, because even though they don't share any of the repetitive dual typings, theirs still contribute to a second effectiveness triangle within their generation starters, And of course, these repetitive dual typings don't even need to be a part of a second effectiveness triangle. Although I'm still not really sure why exactly we got fire fighting types 3 generations in a row. That pun is funny, but it's not that funny. But back onto the second effectiveness triangles, even with the variance to it, they still end up sharing 2 of the same repetitive types, and all of them put together do lead up to my second main issue with starter Pokemon, and that's the constant use of anthropomorphization. I don't have an inherent problem with it. It can lead to plenty of great designs in moderation. It's just that when so many starters end up on 2 legs, you can't help but wish that some of them would get back on all 4s. But in the end, I think the reason that there's such a disproportionate amount of anthropomorphic starters these days is because of the dual typings that they get. Those 3 types, alongside Psychic and Fairy, have always been much more rooted in human nature and ideas. At least to me, and obviously to the devs as well. And so it's natural for Pokemon with those types to look more human in the end. Like, obviously, as you can tell, there are exceptions to that rule, but compared to all of the other types at least, it is more understandable that these typings end up on two legs. And obviously that exception goes both ways, like none of Gen 8 starters have a dual typing, but they all ended up looking very anthropomorphic as well. But to be fair, that generation is sort of sandwiched between all of the other ones that I'm bitching about right now, so they were most likely following design trends rather than anything else. But yeah, that's sort of my thesis for this video, you know, if you move away from less human rooted typings, you'll get less human rooted designs. So how about we have a look at what these less human rooted typings could end up being. So I've relatively diligently gone through all of the types and picked out a few effectiveness triangles that I'd really like to see put into starter Pokemon of the future. And obviously future generations don't need a second effectiveness triangle if they don't want them. It's just like I said, I really enjoy the concept of them, so I would still like them implemented if they can be. And while I will be talking about how these secondary types will work with the primary types effectiveness wise, I'm not going to be suggesting any specific pairings, you know? Which also means I am not going to be designing my own Pokemon. You know, I'm really not that creative. All this is basically just listing off effectiveness triangles within the Pokemon typing system. Like, this is all basically just to let the mind run wild with possibilities if these second typings were real, you know? This is all just a bit of fun. So let's start with the effectiveness triangle that I've thought of the most when it comes to more exciting second types, being electric, ground and flying. I've always enjoyed the idea of this one the most, not just because of the inherently interesting designs that would come out of any primary and secondary combination here, but also because each of these types is super effective against one of the primary starter types. So that turns it into a question of, you know, do you make each of the primary types more resistant to each other, or of course less resistant to each other, or even just keep it neutral, you know? It means that no matter what combination you go for, more of an emphasis is going to be put onto the primary types, which I think is really important with dual typings, you know? It'd just help the trio feel fresh in a way that I'd really appreciate, at least. You know, out of all of these effectiveness triangles, this is the one I'd absolutely like to see the most. But moving on to the next effectiveness triangle, we have ground, steel and ice. I think the appeal of this triangle is that the three types are very earthy. Like, to me at least, I can imagine this starter trio being part of a very naturalistic themed generation. And having a sort of tonal consistency between the three starters is really nice, so I think there is a lot of appeal to this triangle. The next triangle is Bug, Poison and Psychic. And I know I was moaning about Psychic and kind of called it part of the problem, but you know, it's only been a second type to one starter Pokemon so far. I'm sure it's got a lot more creative ideas left in it. I don't have any real interesting talking points for this triangle compared to the other ones. I just think with all of the possible typing combinations that could come from it, the best word I can think to describe it is exotic. Like, I think this triangle could lead to some nice exotic designs, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I would still love to see this triangle, I just don't have as many strong feelings towards it, I guess. But moving on, this last triangle is definitely the most fun, wild, definitely not going to happen one, and that is fire, water and grass. Like, this is a trio of secondary types that they'd only ever try once, if that, but I still think there's a lot of fun to be had with it. And similarly to the electric, round and flying triangle, it can become a question of, do you make each of the starters more or less resistant to each other? But this is still the least likely triangle to happen, I think, even though it has some of the coolest potential ideas attached to it. So those are all of my main ideas for second effectiveness triangles, but of course, like I said, they don't need to use this sort of method for picking second typings. Just as long as they do their best to avoid ghost, dark and fighting, I'll be happy. Like I said, all of these different triangles were all just thought up for a bit of fun, you know? When I first thought about making this kind of video, I was worried about coming across as way too negative, but I like to think I've injected enough optimism into the future of Pokemon starters, you know? My only worry now with how I've come across in this is that I'm way too obsessive with anthropomorphization, but I like to hope I've been in some way balanced across this video. But yeah, if you have any questions or concerns, do let me know. Just my first ever starter Pokemon was Fennekin, and I had no idea what it would evolve into, so when I ended up with a Fire Mage, that was like the coolest thing ever. So, you know, starter Pokemon will always find one way or another to really impress me. But bye bye, have a nice day.